Well, and Tyler will join us when he gets here. Good morning and welcome to the October 5th, 2017 meeting of the Colorado State Board of Land Commissioners. First order of business. Actually, we hold roll call until after the workshop, Bill?
Yeah, fine, but I'll note if the tape is running that there are 4 of the 5 commissioners. Commissioner Carney, sorry, I'm pointing at Barb, and so we redid all the IT in here when we redid the walls, and we're all sort of figuring it out. So
Kim was given a much smaller workspace.
Commissioner Carney's stuck in traffic, and he'll be here shortly.
Great. So the first item on the agenda today, and for those in the public, we're going to have a workshop, which you're cordially invited to join us for. We are going to then break for executive session for what looks like an hour plus or minus, in which at which point everybody will be asked to, the public will be asked to leave, and we'll reconvene for the public meeting after that, probably around 10 o'clock. So if you do
choose to leave, we promise, we know that you're here and we won't skip over you. So
yeah, we will absolutely. So that said, first item on the agenda today is workshop, oil and gas market and regulatory update with Matt Laporte. And thank you for joining us, and hope the traffic wasn't too gnarly.
Well, thank you for having me, and my sincere apologies for being late. No excuse.
Those of us who commute down from the mountains fully appreciate.
Good morning, directors. Crystal Cranda, Minerals Director. As you may be aware, back in June, after the incident in Firestone, the commissioners asked for an update on the flow line issue and different regulations that are taking place. And so staff felt it was appropriate to ask the director of the COGCC, Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, Matt Laporte, to come join us this morning and provide an update. And a little background, prior to being director, Matt Laporte was a member of the law firm Beatty and Wozniak, where he practiced oil and gas regulatory matters, enforcement proceedings, and litigation. And prior to joining at Beatty and Wozniak, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Mr. Laporte was a Colorado Assistant Attorney General, and he represented the COGCC. So,
Matt, thanks for joining us.
And quickly for the record, we have been joined by Commissioner Carney.
Thank you, Crystal. All right, so what I thought, conversations with Bill, I thought, my understanding is you have some relatively new commissioners, may not be terribly familiar with the Oil and Gas Commission, or for that matter, sort of the state of oil and gas in Colorado. So we thought we'd start there, tell you a little bit about the history of oil and gas in Colorado, then how the commission is structured, set up, who sits on the commission, et cetera, how we regulate, and then close with the Firestone incident and the wake and the aftermath of that incident. So here we go. Colorado has a long history of oil and gas. The first commercial wells were developed down around Florence, Colorado in the late 1800s. We would actually lay claim to the second oldest commercial well in the United States. Titusville, Pennsylvania is the site of the first commercial well. Rather famously, Ohio argues with us that they have the second well, but they're not here today to defend them. So it's all ours today. The colors are not very good on that slide. But the grayish areas are all of the oil and gas producing basins in the state. So you can see that we do have oil and gas producing basins around large parts of the state. And I've highlighted there for you, maybe most of you are looking back that way. The first field's there in Florence. The second commercial field, interestingly, at this point in history, in Boulder, 1901. And then I'm going to click through the map here, just quick history of the entire state right after I turn my phone off. Okay, so everybody can see it if I do that. All right, there you go. So we're looking at 1950 here, and we calculate that there were 440 wells had been drilled in the state at that point in time. This is what we call the pre-regulatory era. The Oil and Gas Commission didn't exist, so how accurate that number is subject to some debate. I'm going to jump forward here, I think to 1980, I'll just show you some other fields that came online. The Rangeley field there on the west slope has been in production since the 40s, is still in production today. And then we were established in 1951. So can I get us to 1980? Why not? There we go. So we jump forward 30 years and you can see a lot of wells have been drilled, particularly in this is the DJ Basin. We're estimating that by 1980 there were 21,375 wells drilled. That number is pretty good. The red wells are wells that are active. The black wells are wells that were drilled and abandoned at some point in time. You can see in the 1950s, this basin of gas began to be developed. In the 1960s, eastern Colorado oil fields began to be developed. Eagle County is pretty hasn't seen any development even still, so it's interesting. I mean, you know what the topography is, the geography is there, and in those very mountainous parts of our state, we don't see much oil and gas development. 1973, the Wattenberg field began to be developed, and that area of the state is still the most active area of the state. Different formations being developed now than the D&J sands that are indicated there. Now we've jumped ahead to 2000. You can see the concentration of wells continuing to increase in this area. These are gas plays called coal bed methane. These are untraditional development. The coal bed methane process, first it's a shallower process. You take the water off of the coal seams and the methane migrates out at that point because of the pressure change, as opposed to the more traditional ways of getting gas out. And we're talking about now 40,000 wells almost having been drilled in the state. Jump ahead to 2015 now, 77,000 wells drilled. High concentration here, that just continues to fill in. So think Weld County, Greeley area, Piceance Basin experienced a big boom in production in the 1990s. Coal bed methane continues here. Colorado is one of the largest coal bed methane producers in the United States. So that gets us to 2009, the first successful horizontal well drilled in the state right up here by the Wyoming border. And horizontal production begins in this area. You can see that there are a lot of wells there already, and that has been one of the interesting challenges of development in and around the greater Wattenberg area, that Weld County area. We're putting horizontal wells through fields where there are a lot of existing vertical wells. And then, so I think that's going to take us to where sort of we are today. Colorado is the 7th largest oil producer in the country, 6th largest natural gas producer in the country. We have about 500 operators in the state. The top 10, as you can see, produce most of the oil and gas. There are 200 of those 500 operators that operate 2 or fewer wells. So there's a lot of mom and pop oil and gas operators, just as there are a lot of operators that have thousands of employees and whose names you probably all would recognize. There are 54,000, almost 55,000 active wells in the state. Those are wells we call active wells, wells that are producing, obviously, as well as wells that might be temporarily shut in or temporarily abandoned. 35,000 of those active wells are in Weld County, 11,000 in Garfield County. So those are the top 2 oil and gas counties in the state. There are active wells in 42 different counties, and we now have just shy of 6,000 horizontal wells, almost all of those in Weld County. So don't quite know how much you all know, but horizontal wells have allowed the development of a unconventional resource, which is a shale formation. This oil and gas exist in the shale, but the shale is very tight, not permeable. And the combination of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing has allowed that resource to be developed. And it just so happens that in Colorado, the primary shale formation, at least the most accessible shale formation, is in that Weld County DJ Basin area. Yes,
As a clarification, the fracking had been used for years in the vertical wells as well, right?
absolutely
Correct.
true. Roughly 1947-ish, most people would pin the first fracking job, and probably in the Haugaton field just east of us in Kansas. So we refer to fracking as well stimulation or completion, and it's accurate in the sense that pressure or force. So early fracking was done with dynamite to increase that permeability of the formation to allow the hydrocarbon to flow into the well more efficiently. And that's still what's being done. The difference with shale is that the oil and gas just essentially won't flow without the stimulation process, whereas the conventional formations have enough permeability and pressure that the hydrocarbons would come into the well, but it helps if you stimulate them a little bit. It is a big industry in Colorado. Not our job to advertise the industry, but just by way of background, these statistics are, I think, 2012 economic statistics. So just shy of $30 billion to the economy. A lot of that goes to the public. Dramatic growth in development, deploying of horizontal wells in the state. So again, I showed you 2009, the very first successful horizontal well. In 2010, these are compared to all wells being drilled in the state, how many were horizontal? So 2010, less than 5%, kind of doubles the next year, more or less triples the year after that, doubles again. So in 7 or so years, we've gone from 5% to almost 3% all new wells drilled on horizontal wells. So rapid and dramatic transformation of the way hydrocarbons are developed. That has contributed to this dynamic, which is a series of record production in oil and gas in the state that started in 2013. So if you look at 25 to 2010, you're looking at about a 6 or 7% year-over-year growth in oil production. You could attribute a lot of that to simply bringing new wells onto line. You can see 2011, now we're seeing some of the horizontal production, and we start getting these double-digit increases in oil production. The Niobrara Shale in Weld County is an oil play as opposed to a gas play. So the dramatic change has been in oil production. So if we just scroll forward here, huge increase year over year from 2013 to 2014, and 2013 was already a record. That trend continued in 2015, and the trend did come to an end in 2016. Of course, you are probably aware that the oil and gas prices, especially the oil price, collapsed essentially in late 2014. So throughout 2015, you saw oil go from over $100 a barrel to under $30 a barrel at one point. The fact that production in 2016 only fell 7% is sort of amazing given the commodity price. 2017, we're on track right now for something about around 112 million barrels of production. So let me talk a little bit about the commission makeup. As I noted, we were created in 1951. We are a statutory body, just as you are. And in you're not. You're constitutional. I always hate it when you remind me of that. You're you're higher than us. It's true that the legislature can wipe me out tomorrow which I'm sure on certain days they're tempted to do. So in 1951, the directive to the commission was prevent the waste of oil and gas. And there's some history to that word that I won't go into, but it certainly means don't produce more than you can consume, and it similarly means don't leave it in the ground if you can get it out efficiently and effectively. Whoops, I went too far, I think. Yeah. Our mission today is different. Our mission is to foster the responsible and balanced development of the resource, protect public health, safety, and welfare, still to prevent waste, and also protect correlative rights. Correlative rights are the rights of separate owners within a common field to have the ability to develop that gas, rather than one person putting their straw in the milkshake and taking it all without everybody else having an opportunity to have their share. In 1951, the commission was 5 members, all with oil and gas experience. All the way until 2008, it was still dominated by oil and gas related folks, 5 out of 7. In 2008, the legislature passed, amended the bill at the urging of then Governor Ritter to reconfigure the board so that there are 9 members now, 3 with oil and gas experience. Our members include the executive directors of the Department of Natural Resources, which is where our agency sits, as does yours, and the executive director of the Department of Public Health and Environment, the other 7 appointed by the governor. Our statute lays out specific sort of niches that those 7 must fill. There must be someone from the ag industry, someone from the environmental, soil conservation, et cetera. The legislature gave us very broad authority to work in the oil and gas space, so I've highlighted what to me are always sort of the most impactful words there. So within a narrow space, we have pretty broad authority. The day-to-day work gets done by the staff that I lead, and we currently are authorized for 111 FTE in those 5 units that you see. About 60 of our employees are in an office building that is right over there on Lincoln Street, and the others are deployed throughout the state. Our inspectors and many of our environmental professionals live in the areas where they work so that they have easy access, obviously, to where they are going to do their work, and so they can get to know those fields and those areas.
Is that number grown? Sorry.
Yeah, sure. A lot, even in the 5 years that I've been the director. When I started, there were 75 employees. In 2013, the legislature authorized 18 additional employees at that time, if my memory is correct. They authorized 12 coming out of the Governor's Oil and Gas Task Force in 2015. So that's 30, 105, and somewhere I've lost track of the other 6 or so.
Are those focused around oversight or enforcement, or just broad?
In 2013, the real focus was on increasing our number of inspectors. So if I think my number is right, I think 18 at that time, 11 of whom were designated to be inspectors. What we like to do is understand that if we're going to have 11 more inspectors out in the field and they may find violations, identify violations, we need the capacity among the other groups to say prosecute that violation, have environmental people on staff to respond to environmental impacts that might turn up. So we need a little bit of balancing out around the other divisions, and that's what we explained to the legislature in 2013, and that continues to be true. We continue to ask for some ratio among the inspectors to the other groups. This just gives a breakdown of those field groups. So out of that 111, you can see that 67 are either in field inspectors, engineers, or environmental people who are really focused on what's happening in the field. All right, quick shot on sort of the overall regulatory structure. The commission obviously has the authority to enact regulations that have the force of law, and we do that. I'll show you a slide here in a minute. We've done it with some regularity over the last 5 years. We permit all wells. We permit all new well locations separately from the wells themselves. We permit other things, including pits and things like that. We've talked about the inspection staff. We have a hearings group that does the enforcement for those violations that are identified by the inspectors. That staff has grown, and then we do try to work collaboratively with local governments. Lots of regulations, a couple hundred pages, 12 series, really cover development of oil and gas throughout the state, really from A to Z. We speak in terms of a lot of exploration and production. That is the end of the life cycle that we regulate. We don't regulate how oil and gas moves in pipelines or trucks after it leaves the storage tank on the wellhead and goes to a processing facility. And we don't regulate how it goes from that processing facility to your home in the case of natural gas, or the gasoline tanks at the service station in the case of oil. And we are in the middle of a rulemaking right now, which I'll talk about in a minute, but the regulations do continue to evolve. So here's just a list of the major ones, the major rules since 2011. In 2011, what was in that frack water was a huge issue. That issue really emerged in 2008, and it wasn't until 2011 that rules were adopted. In 2012, Colorado became the first state in the country to require operators to sample groundwater both before they drilled to get a baseline and after they drilled to see if there have been impacts. In 2012, we moved the distance between an existing home and a new well. That is still one of the single largest controversial topics. If you remember, there have been ballot initiatives introduced in 2016 and 2014 to have a larger setback on a statewide basis. And we still hear a lot that local communities would like the setback distance to be greater. Spill reporting in 2013, the Department of Public Health and Environment in 2014 adopted really the first methane emissions in the country for oil and gas. Our penalty and enforcement authority was increased in 2014. We did some rules after the Governor's Task Force in 2015, and the rulemaking that we're in right now pertains to flow lines in the post-Firestone era, as you might imagine. One of the most important things we do really is regulate how the wellbore gets constructed, and that is how our engineers think about it. They think about it as a construction project. They used to think about it as sort of a building, except the building is going from the surface to underneath the ground. Now it goes underneath the ground for 7,000 feet roughly and goes out through the formation. At this point, probably the most common lateral length is 1.5 miles, and the second most common length is 2 miles. So it's actually hard to wrap your head around if you really stop and think about it, that you have a wellbore that is almost 3 miles total length from the surface, down more than 1 mile, out 2 miles. Lots of efficiencies to be gained from doing that. So these are just some of the ways that we seek to protect groundwater, and it starts with that wellbore construction. We are unique among producing states, to the best of my knowledge, in this 2-permit process. This started in 2008 so that we not only issue a permit for every single individual well, we also issue a permit separately for the surface location where those wells in most cases will be located. And on the surface area, we're looking at what are potential environmental receptors around that location? What is the community around that location? What is the traffic around that location? What is the access to that location? All of those things are evaluated and taken into consideration in issuing a permit. 31 inspectors, that includes our manager. She doesn't get out into the field much, so we usually talk about 30. In 2016, they did 42,000 inspections of wells. I want to be careful to say that that doesn't mean 42,000 different wells got inspected. Some wells get inspected more than once. They did go to 22,000 separate oil and gas locations. If we started at well number 1 and stopped at well number 54,000, it would take us 1.3 years to run that cycle. That's not how we do our inspections. We have a risk-based approach. We have identified criteria that suggest to us that certain wells should get looked at sooner than others, and we look at those wells, for that reason. Once we've looked at them, they sort of go back down the list. So it's a dynamic process. And then the enforcement program, again, in 2014, we were given greater statutory penalty authority. We have beefed up the numbers in our enforcement staff. We have written a new enforcement and penalty policy. When this all took place, there was a bill introduced in 2013, if my memory is right, that did not pass to increase our penalty authority. And the governor at that point issued an executive order, which essentially said we should be holding operators to the highest standard of operators in the country. We started drafting our penalty policy then and our enforcement policy then to meet that aspiration. In 2014, I think, then the penalties legislation did pass, raised our penalty authority from $1,000 a day to $15,000 a day, and took away a $10,000 cap on the penalty. So we really have no cap on our penalties right now. And you can just see that year over year, since then, that total number, that average number of the penalty has gone up. I'm going to pause there because the next topic is Firestone. Can I answer any questions? Anything you're curious about?
Remediation, like when a well that type of stuff, is that under your purview? I know you have standards because
Yes.
we've had conversations here about how those interplay with OGCC, but you didn't really touch on that. Can you touch on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, a couple of things. Operators are obligated by our rules to both plug and abandon a well when they're done with it and to reclaim the location essentially back to pre-drilling standards. And to some extent, that process starts when the location is built by, for example, they are supposed to preserve and essentially store the topsoil so the topsoil can be, deployed again. The entire subject of not only, reclaiming, reclamation, but also plugging wells, you're going to spotlight a little bit more. We do hold financial assurance for operators for the wells that they drill so that if they don't meet that obligation, there is money available. That obligation would fall to the state. The financial assurance is not enough to cover the obligation. That's the simplest way I can say it. And in fact, we delivered a letter to Senator Ray Scott and Representative Bob Rankin yesterday in response to questions they had asked about sort of the scope of that. So I'm not going to go into a lot of details about that, but it's just not a secret that there's not enough financial assurance to really do a complete job of plugging wells and reclaiming sites. So we are dependent on operators to do that as they're obligated to do. We are concerned in this economic environment that there are operators out there who may not be in a good position to fulfill those obligations. So I'll get to it at the end of this section, but one of the recommendations that the governor put forward was to meet with industry and talk with industry about the establishment of a separate dedicated fund for plugging and abandoning and reclaiming those sites. There are a few states around the country who have a fund like that. We have talked most about a fund in Oklahoma that is managed by something called the Oklahoma Energy Resources Board, or OERB. It is funded by voluntary contributions from industry. I like the voluntary part in this case because the state collects the money first and then the operators can ask for it back if they want to at the end of the year. We're told the participation rate is in the mid 90s in terms of operators, not less than 10% are asking for that money back at the end of the year. So that conversation has started with industry.
Well, just
Yeah, sure.
the commissioners. Describe the nature of, their role. I mean, obviously governance, but what are they seeing day to day? Where are they? You talked about, what are the issues that they're tackling at their level? What elevates to them for action?
Good question. So the commission issues orders, and only the commission can issue orders. And orders are done for things like spacing units, which I didn't really talk about, but a spacing unit is the area, in essence, the area that a single well will drain and may encompass more than one mineral interest owner within that spacing unit. In today's world of horizontal wells, spacing units have gone from a traditional, conventional spacing unit could, in Colorado, range from, well, honestly, 10 acres in the Piceance Basin to 40 acres in some of the D&J sands to 320 acres in other parts of the state. But we'll just say it was really sort of 40 acres to 320 acres. For horizontal development, it's 640 acres, which is a square mile, to 1,280 acres, which is 2 square miles, and larger. So again, that wellbore is running, that horizontal length is a 2-mile lateral. So you need that. And we're putting more than one horizontal within those 2-mile by 1-mile spacing units. So that can only be created by order of the commission. So all of those order things go to the commission. There's a thing called statutory pooling, also beginning to be somewhat controversial, but a tool that has been used since the 1930s, since spacing units were created. I might have at the end of this a different slide I could show you for fun. Without spacing and pooling, the only way to protect your own mineral rights are to drill your own well on your own land. And that turns out to be not very efficient. So if all of us were shared mineral owners in a pool that was the size of this room, that we knew could be drained with a single well, spacing or a pooling process, as soon as I drill my well, I'm draining your minerals. And the only way for you to protect your minerals is to drill your own well. So in this room, I'd have a well, you'd have a well, you'd have a well, and they'd all be right there. Not very efficient. So that's why spacing units and pooling orders were created. So the commission has to do that. The commission has to do all the rules. The commission has to do any enforcement action that involves a penalty. So officially, that's sort of their domain. Okay.
Just because sadly, what I know about oil drilling, I've seen in movies or read in the popular media.
Read the prize if you want to know.
When we read, there will be blood.
Yeah,
that's how you protect those mineral rights. There's been a fair amount of reportage about seismic activity in Oklahoma and the correlation with fracking. Can you just weigh in a little bit on that?
Sure. So yeah, Oklahoma had a true epidemic of, we talk about induced seismicity, 99%, which is not 100%, of the induced seismic activity related to oil and gas is the result of injecting produced water into a disposal well. So it's not being triggered by the fracking activity itself. Producing oil and gas, when what the well brings up out of the ground, in most cases, is 3 things: oil, gas, and water. The water that exists naturally in the formation. And in the case of these larger frac jobs, you're putting water down the hole, and that water comes back out. So we talk about that as flow back, but there is water in the formation that comes out. We talk about that as produced water. The single most prevalent way of disposing of the produced water, which is highly saline, that's not quite right, it's brackish salty water, It has other stuff in it. It may have traces of hydrocarbons in it. It is not something you want spilled on the ground or without treatment of some kind put into surface water. So disposing of it into injection wells, which are regulated by EPA, and in Colorado's case, the EPA program has been delegated to the COGCC, so we regulate those injection wells. It is the injection of that produced water that has led to induced seismicity. We have had 2 seismic events that we know of that were triggered by, we assume, we believe, we concluded, by disposal. The reason we've had 2 and Oklahoma at one point was having 5 a day is because Oklahoma has way more injection wells than we do and injects way, way, way more produced water than we do. So we view it as a manageable risk in that we believe that we understand the mechanisms that have contributed to those 2 events in Colorado and can permit wells in ways that avoid one of those, which is the depth of the well. And the second mechanism there is the volume of produced water being injected.
Talk about depths a little bit. There's groundwater that people fear, and that's at a certain depth. There's where the formation is, and that's at a much deeper level. And then there's the injection well, which is even deeper still. Can you give folks a feel for the scale of that?
Sure. So aquifers from which we draw drinking water are almost never deeper than 1,000 feet, more like a few hundred feet. The formation, the Niobrara Shale we've talked about, is about 7,200 feet deep. The coal bed methane I mentioned, that's a shallower situation and a different production formation or production process, but even coal bed methane is sub 3,000 feet typically. There is lots of separation. And then the injection wells are not always deeper than the formation there. So you can inject water back into a depleted formation as one example. There's also a way to inject water to enhance production from older fields. It's called enhanced oil recovery. So you can inject water for that purpose. But what we do before we issue a permit is analyze that formation and make a calculation of the volume of water that can be absorbed by the rock in a 1/4 mile radius around that injection well. So that's the calculation. That ends up being a lifetime limit on the amount of water that can be injected into that well. And we do set, and especially in the post-induced seismic world, we set limits on the pressure at which that water can be injected. And the real key to the depth question, Bill, and this comes out, I know, after a lot of research on the induced seismicity, geologists speak of a basement rock or a crystalline basement. So there's a point at which you're getting to rock that is just not permeable. And one of the keys to avoiding induced seismicity is not to inject down to that depth. So we look at that and we try to stay several hundred feet above that depth so that there's some capacity there. I said 99%, and you have a follow-up, Mr. Moffett?
So yes, there's clearly disposing of the water is one of the objectives. Is stabilizing the area where you've extracted fluid part of the thought process for injecting the water? Or is it just because it's a safe place to put water?
Yeah, I think the latter more than the former. I mean, are you sort of saying like a subsidence sort of scenario?
Exactly.
Yeah. I am not aware of any subsidence issues triggered by either disposal or removal of that produced water that have happened in Colorado. So I said 99%. I do want to say that there have been documented incidents in Ohio. I think there's one in Oklahoma, a couple in Ohio, a couple in Canada, where the frac job itself has led to some amount of seismicity. And in Ohio, they have begun a regulatory regime of having seismic monitors around the frac job. And I do not know the details of exactly well, I just don't know all of the details of that. But they are monitoring seismic events during frac jobs. As far as I know, Ohio is the only state doing that, and we have not felt it necessary to do that thus far. In Colorado, for sort of the reasons I've explained, we just haven't seen the seismic activity that some of those other states have seen.
Thank you.
Going back briefly, this is Ed Hamrick, to you were describing the gap between financial assurance and need. Does your agency see a role that royalty owners can play in addressing that at the leasing stage? And do you have any recommendations for royalty owners?
It's a fair question, Ed, to which I'm probably not prepared to give much of an answer. I mean, could you negotiate that in a lease? Is that what you're asking? Yeah,
What protection would the royalty owner want? Wouldn't it really be more a surface owner question? I mean, the bond is for the surface reclamation and the removal of the stuff. It strikes me that that would be more something that the surface owner would want to negotiate into the release. So I still like the question, but
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with that at all. I'm just, in terms of basically in the leasing process, is there a role or, and again, I don't mean to put you on the spot, so.
all right. I'm pretty good at dodging the spot if I have to.
So feel free. I know where you live.
Right. I think a challenge. I think that the operator's view of the world would be that the state regulates that, and that takes preeminence over, what a surface owner or a mineral owner might try to do. But we see a lot of things happen in contract, and we stay out of contract negotiations.
You addressed the makeup of the board, but what is the background of the governor appointed people on your board versus the oil and gas industry?
Okay, so keep in mind, of the 9, there are 2 that hold by virtue of their title, right? The executive directors of those 2 departments. Everyone else is appointed by the governor, and the requirements in the statute I probably can't recite off the top of my head, other than to say, as I did, one of those 7 has to be a representative of local government. One of those 7 has to be from the West Slope. One of the 7 has to have an environmental background. One has to be a mineral owner and have an agricultural background. And one has to have a soil conservation background. So I think those are all the boxes that have to be checked. Of the 7, there cannot be a greater than 1 person advantage among the 2 major political parties. So you can only have 4 R's and 3 D's, or vice versa. If we get a Green Party candidate or somebody in there, I don't know what happens, but you can only be off by 1 in the R's and D's. And then the oil and gas folks, 2 of them have to be professional engineers. Either a petroleum engineer, or there's one other choice for an engineer. Maybe they can be a professional geologist. So all 3 of those folks do have to, have experience in the oil and gas, and 2 of them have to have engineering degrees.
Thank you.
better let you keep going.
Yeah. Tell me where we are in time.
We're getting a little bit late start,
10
so
minutes?
we've got 10 minutes work.
Yeah, sure.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Firestone. That's not how I thought that slide would look. Let's see what happens next.
And puppets.
It's telling.
There we go. So I'm going to assume most of you have some knowledge of Firestone. I'll tell you that what I'm going to show you here are some slides that I extracted from a presentation that I gave earlier this week to the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission, which happened to be meeting in Pittsburgh. So this is a sort of a condensed Reader's Digest version. But on April 17th, which happened to be a Monday, at 4:45 in the afternoon, this happened. That is a residence in Firestone, Colorado. Most of you, I'm sure, know that Firestone is only about 30 miles north, straight up I-25, just to the east of I-25. That is a residence that was owned by the Martinez family. The Martinezes, Mark and his wife Erin, had 2 children, a boy 11 and a girl 9. At the time of the explosion, Mark and his brother-in-law, Joey Irwin, were in the basement working on their water heater. They were killed, we assume instantaneously. Erin was on the main floor of the house. She was trapped beneath falling debris and burning debris from the house. She was rescued by construction workers. Just on, we could step into that picture, just to the back side of that picture, condominium units were going up. The construction workers commandeered a forklift and drove it through the fence that you see into the house to lift the debris off of Erin to rescue her and save her life. The 11-year-old was in the house. The best information we have is that he was on the upper floors of the house and was blown out a window and received minor scrapes. And the 9-year-old girl was not home. We officially learned of this the next morning. There was some news coverage of this event Monday night, and the focus was on the fact that the men were working on the water heater. COGCC sent inspectors, and we have engineers in a dedicated group for flow lines called the Flow Line Integrity Group. So we had an inspector and a flow line integrity specialist respond to the site. That's what that house looked like the next day. The house that you see standing was also damaged in the fire, and those people were evacuated. That's a little more dramatic view of what was left of the house. I'll point out, I'll use the mouse, I may not be able to show it to you. I don't think I have all the pictures, but so here's the fence that I presume was knocked down so that the forklift could get into the home. You'll see in this corner lots and lots of debris. I'll come back to that in a minute. This photograph taken that Tuesday at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, a little after 1, was taken by our engineering flow line integrity specialist who went to the site. What we're seeing here is we call these risers, these rigid pipes coming up out of the ground. This is a 2-inch riser. It's a steel riser. You can see it's been capped. This is a 1-inch riser. It's got a valve there. The valve there is in the closed position. And you can see that it's plumbed. This is the wellhead right here. And you can see that this riser is plumbed to the wellhead. Our inspector asked the owners of the well, which happens to be Anadarko Oil Company, where this flow line went. And they said, it goes to a tank battery off to the west. And our inspector said, will you please show me? And it turns out it didn't go to the tank battery to the west. So that's when plot thickened, as they say. Eventually, it was determined that this flow line was thought to have been abandoned, that the flow lines originally went from this well to a tank battery to the north of the neighborhood, and beginning late on Tuesday and into Wednesday and into Thursday, the investigation was to find and excavate those flow lines. The pipeline attached to this is made of polypipe plastic. It is not steel and cannot be traced. but it was laid with the steel lines, which is often what is done so that you can trace it by following the steel lines. This is what it looked like when they found it. It was cut, as you can see, it's been cut cleanly, and it terminated about 7 feet from the foundation of the home that exploded. Here you can see now the trench that they dug to unearth the pipeline. That's the basement, that's the foundation. That's obviously a basement window there. And I wanted to show you a little bit. You can't see it very well in this picture, but all of that debris that had been piled up in this corner had to be removed for everybody to even get this far with that trench. So for that first week, really, these little pieces are coming together slowly. But by about Thursday night of that week, we understood that the flow line terminated more or less where it did, that as they excavated that, they were smelling hydrocarbons, that the well itself, that valve I showed you that was in the off position Monday had been in the on position. So keep in mind too that the lead investigator as far as the origin and the cause of the explosion in this case is the Frederick Firestone Fire Protection District. That is not our jurisdiction. The gentleman in the gray shirt and hat here is taking a soil gas sample. That gentleman is one of our environmental protection specialists. And our response early in this process was focused on the environmental impacts that resulted from the introduction of those hydrocarbons into the environment. On Wednesday, I think, or Thursday, he's taking a sample right there at the edge of the trench. He also took samples from the window wells. He took samples from the neighbor's backyard and from the neighbor's window well. The concentrations of hydrocarbons where he is right now were very high. Methane was at 100% of something called the lower explosive limit, which is about 5% by volume or 50,000 parts per million. It's high. You don't want it that way. And the same was true in the backyard of the neighbors. It was pretty high concentration there. Here's what we know about the well. It was, let's see, I'm going to back up real quick. This is probably the best picture. The well itself sat 170 feet from the fence line back over this way. So it's a little bit south and a little bit east of their fence line, about 175 feet. The well was built in 1993. There you go. The home was built in 2015. So there were questions, of course, about that setback distance. We regulate where wells get built in relation to existing homes. We do not regulate where existing homes get built in relation to existing wells. Having said that, I will say that, in my opinion, the setback distance wasn't relevant here. What was relevant was where the flow line ended in relation to the home. So it was built in 93. It's a vertical well. It was active at the time, and the well had changed hands 4 times between 93 and 2014. Most recently, Anadarko acquiring it from Noble in 2014 in a large swap of acreage that they did. There are 2 things I want to explain with this picture. One, the blue lines are lines that were surveyed for methane by a vehicle-mounted ground-sensing methane monitor device, which was deployed at our direction that same Thursday, I believe. And all the blue lines are the roads that it traversed sniffing for methane. So this is the entire neighborhood. The home, the Martinez home, was right there. And you can actually kind of see the well pad over here. The other thing I just want to show you is that the well pad was here. The western tank battery that was built is here. The northern tank battery where the flow line originally ran is right up here, but I think that's a well pad, and I think the tank battery was right up here. You can't quite see it. The development of this subdivision happened from north to south, starting in 1999. So in 99, they platted this. This is up here. The flow line runs up there, and there are maps that show this flow line to be removed and rerouted to this western tank battery, obviously to get it out of where the subdivision is going to be developed. The other thing that's interesting is that as these homes got built from north to south, on every one of these streets, there are sewer lines. So sewer lines were being dug and cut and installed, and almost certainly would have cut that flow line every single time as they came south. Similarly, you have basements being excavated along the route. So again, here's the home that exploded. And as this flow line passes up through here, you would think that flow line may have been encountered many times. So there are mysteries around whether the flow line was never disconnected at the wellhead, or whether maybe it had been disconnected at the wellhead originally and later got reconnected without a full understanding of where it went at the time. We had concerns that if at one time the flow line was intact all the way up to Valley Vista, for example, did we have possibly hydrocarbons in the ground at Valley Vista, which is one of the reasons we did the survey, and we're relieved to see that there was no indication of that happening. We subsequently did, so again, our focus was really on the environmental impacts. We subsequently did soil gas sampling starting right around 6312 and up and down Twilight, and that sampling showed, again, no impacts beyond the 6312 Twilight and the house to the west that was also damaged. No indication of soil gas sample in any of the neighbors' houses beyond those two. I'll just point out, since I have this picture up, the open space that you can see here was intentionally left open to create the 150-foot setback that the municipality required from that well. So that's why those two lots are still vacant. The methane vehicle did detect two anomalies, one right here next to this tank battery. So there you can see where the existing tank battery is. And then right here on this Oak Meadows Boulevard, which is a major north-south thoroughfare, again, 6312 sits over about here, and the other wellhead over here. We eventually went back to that anomaly, and what we found looks like this. There was a very large pocket of hydrocarbon in the subsurface around that anomaly, and what we learned is that from the wellhead here, the flow line went up. Here's 6312. It had a Y connection in it, and the flow line went on over to the tank battery that was over here. That flow line had also been cut here, presumably when the sewer line went in underneath the street at Oak Meadows Boulevard. And so for however long that line was connected and flowing hydrocarbons to this area, it was similarly doing so to this area. The very good news is that plume, as you can see, did not extend to the houses to the north. It stopped here. And again, at our direction, the operator, Anadarko, in this case, established a remediation system in this area and this area called soil vapor extraction that, luckily for all of us, was very effective in getting the hydrocarbons out of the ground. Our immediate response, which was announced on May 2nd, which was the same day that the Frederick Firestone Fire Protection District announced that their determination that the cause and origin of the explosion was odorless gas, methane, from that flow line infiltrating into the basement of the home through a sump system that the home had in it, and then finding an ignition source. we issued a notice to operators to address the two things to us that were the surest way to minimize any possibility that something like this happen again. This is another well that was in the area, not the well that led to the that had the flow line connected, but for illustration purposes, we have a similar situation here. You can see these risers coming out of the ground. They've got a cap on them. This is the same kind of 1-inch riser we saw at the other one, the same kind of 2-inch riser. And here now we have these active risers that are plumbed. Here's the wellhead. This is an active riser. We know this has hydrocarbons going probably to a tank battery. We ordered operators to do two things. We ordered them to identify the beginning point and end point of every single active flow line on any well or tank battery within 1,000 feet of a building unit. All right, so one of the problems in Firestone is you have a connection to a pressure source at one end and nothing at the other end. Or stated slightly differently, you know it's connected here and you don't know where it goes. So part one of the notice to operators was you make sure you know where it goes and that it's connected properly at both ends if it's connected to a pressure source. The second thing is that they have these risers, and the risers at least create the opportunity that somebody decides to take that cap off and connect it to a pressure source without fully understanding where it goes. And so our current rules, current as of 2001, in 2001, we required that these risers be cut off below the ground so that that possibility is eliminated. But that rule, like most of our rules, aren't retroactive. So if you abandon that flow line before 2001, you could leave it as you see it. The notice to operators required everybody to go find those abandoned risers and cut them off below the ground. Statewide, no 1,000-foot limit. So every single well. So those were the two things that we ordered operators to do. We gave them, we did it in two phases. First 30 days, that ended on June 1st, to sort of identify everything, and another 30 days in the case of the active lines to pressure test them to make sure they held, that they had integrity, and with respect to the inactive risers to cut them off below grade. And these two slides just say what I've just told you. The result was, and operators, I will tell you, dedicated a significant resources to getting that work done and getting it done in time. We granted 7 requests for a 30-day extension of time for what in our estimation were good reasons. But what we have today is 177 operators who reported their inventories to us. An inventory of 23,000 wells that were examined, 11,800 locations examined, 120,000 flow line segments identified and tested. As you can see, the vast majority passed. We had 428 reported to us that didn't pass. Those failed lines are shut in now and either awaiting abandonment or repair so that they can be used again. And then we have about 10% of the volume that were tested that we need to sort of sort out. That one of the biggest challenges of this exercise was the data management. We were asking operators to submit to us a tremendous amount of data in a very short time, and it's not data that there was any process for, no prior procedure or precedent for giving us this data. So we know there was duplication. We know there were, errors in data entry, et cetera. And so the 10% that we're working with here, we think are tied to those kinds of things. And we're working through those as quickly as we can. I probably need to quicken this up. Is that a word? Speed up. So the governor issued 7 recommendations. This first one there is flow line regulations. We are doing that. working with the Utility Notification Center of Colorado to have a more robust system for identifying lines when people go to dig, working on the orphan well plug and abandonment fund that we talked about. Those are kind of the key ones. And the flow line rules are in process now. All of the available documents are on our website. We anticipate holding that hearing in December. And they will just, the two key things are our existing rules have an exception for low pressure lines. We're going to get rid of that exception. And we're going to make by rule that requirement that those risers get cut off below grade. We're going to do that retroactively. So there's no more above grade risers. So thank you for your time, and I'm sorry for going long.
I think when this first came up, the commissioner's question to staff was, what should we be doing
Right.
as the landowner, mineral owner, lessor? And I just want to be sure that from what you've heard from Matt today, you're comfortable that either there are not any actions we need to take independently, or if there are some, that we get that feedback.
I'd turn that question over to Matt. As the landowner and the mineral rights owner, are there steps we should be taking in addition to what COGC is requiring?
I mean, I feel like all landowners are an extension of our inspection group, right? I mean, we sort of count on the eyes of the landowners too, to occasionally at least have an eye on your locations and understand what's going on. So, if you see an abandoned line that is above ground, it shouldn't happen. You're pointing to the sky. Oh.
Thank you. Tell Pat. There we go.
Let there be light.
A voice from the dark.
Yeah. Those shouldn't be there, and it's worth asking questions about if you see something like that, why those are there.
I don't know that we need a staff protocol, but we ought to talk about making sure that
That Steve is looking at those things
any
when he's out.
mystery is questioned.
Yeah. And so there's this question of what can you do in your lease and by contract. It's certainly fair game to ask your operators about their integrity testing protocols and when their integrity tests were last done and things like that.
Anybody else, or shall we move along? Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all, and Bill knows how to find me, and any follow-up questions, let me know.
At this point, we will call the meeting to order, and Bill, if you wouldn't mind calling the roll. Wait. Even before, we're not going to executive session yet, though, Kim. This is still public. Is that?
We are going to go to executive session.
Okay, cool. We're waiting.